Well, this morning, in our first reading, we read a story of someone who inspires us to a great hope, even in really difficult circumstances. In Jeremiah's time, 3 enormous imperial powers were locked in a fight with one another, trying to control the trade routes that went between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia were locked into a total war with one another. They deployed mercenaries. They burned crops a field full of crops. They starved cities through siege warfare. They captured villages, raided them, took everything of value away from them, and then razed them to the ground. They kidnapped children and made them slaves. They killed entire populations and didn't bother with burying the bodies. They made Game of Thrones look like a mild dispute over afternoon tea. And caught right in the middle of all of this violence and animosity was the kingdom of Judah, a tiny little country with its capital of Jerusalem. Well, the Babylonians marched against Judah also, and they started by attacking the outlying cities. And one by one, they took over all those villages. And the Judeans talked to each other in the villages through fire signals because the Babylonians had cut off the other ways they could communicate. And there were fires, one by one, all over Judah, signaling that village after village and city after city had fallen. Well, in Jeremiah 32, we read that all of Judea was taken over, except for that capital of Jerusalem. And there was the prophet Jeremiah within the city walls. At this point, we need to put a pin in our story and explore a couple hidden layers that will help make sense of the rest that follows. When the kingdom of Judah was first established, God came to the people and said that God wanted their society to be egalitarian, where everyone had access to the resources they needed to flourish and live well. And so there were a lot of stipulations that were given in the Old Testament to help guide these people into a loving and caring community. One of those stipulations we find in the book of Leviticus. And what it said was that if a family encountered financial duress that would cause them to have to sell their agricultural lands, that they would look to the nearest relative who had the means to buy those lands. And that relative was expected to purchase that property. The reasoning behind this went that originally the land was equally distributed throughout people. And so they wanted to keep land within these family units so that powerful families didn't end up owning the entire towns they lived in. So they wanted an egalitarian society, not an oligarchy. All right, now, another layer. We read of the prophet Jeremiah. Well, prophets in the ancient world had a calling from God to speak hard truths to folks. This oftentimes made prophets not very liked. And apparently Jeremiah had spoken a hard truth to some of the people in his hometown of Ananoth. And so those folks tried to kill Jeremiah. They wanted him dead. Not metaphorically. They were actively trying to kill the guy. All right. back to our story. The Babylonians have surrounded Jerusalem. Jeremiah is there confined in the city walls. Well, Jeremiah's cousin, probably at night, slipped through the lines of the Babylonians and got into Jerusalem. And he told Jeremiah that his uncle was in a financial pinch, and he had to sell his ancestral lands in Ananoth. And since Jeremiah was the closest relative with the means to buy those lands, he expected Jeremiah to do that. Now, Jeremiah faced an ethical crossroad. What would he choose to do? Buy that land or not? This was a difficult choice. It's not an easy thing. The country was at war. And it was very clear the Babylonians were going to win. And when the Babylonians did win, it was highly unlikely they were going to respect any kind of sales that had gone on between Judean people. The Babylonians would go in and just take whatever land they wanted for themselves. But even if the Babylonians didn't do this, Ananoth was in a pretty remote region along the desert. And so those agricultural lands were pounded by dry desert wind. They got very little rain. It wasn't the kind of investment property that you would really want. And plus, the people of Ananoth wanted Jeremiah dead. So, who in their right minds would really want to buy a piece of land in an undesirable place that probably wouldn't have a huge return on investment, surrounded by people who are actively trying to kill you? That's the situation Jeremiah faced. In spite of this, Jeremiah purchased that land. And he did so by making a spectacle of the purchase. So, he gathered up his money, made a show of it, assembled witnesses together there in Jerusalem, signed the legal documents, presented them to the judges, and put the deeds of sale into an earthenware jar. This act was not merely just fulfilling societal obligations. It wasn't merely trying to make his family happy. What Jeremiah did was a prophetic act where he was trying to teach the people around him two important lessons. One, even in the most difficult situations where it doesn't look like any good outcome is possible, there is still hope, because God is still at work creating a just and caring world. So Jeremiah was telling people, never lose hope. Jeremiah placed those deeds of sale into an earthenware jar. And archaeologists all over the ancient Mediterranean love it when they find these earthenware jars, because these jars survive almost anything. They can survive shipwrecks, they can survive fires, and they keep the stuff inside them whole. So even if the Babylonians came into Jerusalem, destroyed the city, burned it to the ground, Jeremiah's purchase would outlive that. It would remain whole in that jar as a sign to say the Babylonians were temporary, but what God is doing here is God will raise up this community from the ashes, and we need to have hope in that. Well, second meaning Jeremiah was trying to teach. Even in this difficult and conflicted world that we live in, God calls us to live in ways in which we support ourselves and our own desires, but we also care and support the needs and desires of the people around us. So we work for the flourishing of our communities as a whole. Jeremiah could have taken that money that he used to buy that plot of land out in Ananoth, and he could have bought other parcels closer to the capital. And then he could have leveraged those purchases to buy more land, and then leveraged those to buy more land, and could have consolidated his power. I don't know if you've heard this saying by this guy, a banking giant, the Baron Rothschild. He said, "The time to buy is when there's blood in the streets." Is you take advantage of a situation and consolidate your own power. Well, that's not what Jeremiah did. What he did was care for his family that was in need, but in doing that, he was participating in these structures of the nation that God had laid out that provided for an egalitarian society, that provided for everyone to have means of support and care. And Jeremiah's actions help explain our gospel reading. It's a tough reading. I don't know if y'all were squirming as I was when I was having to read that thing. But we read about a rich man who threw parties every night. And there was a person in need that was right outside his door. And he never gave that person even one single bite of the leftover food that they had. In Jesus' time, there was an expectation that if you had a big party, you would give some of the food to folks in your community who were hungry and in need. And this rich man didn't respect that at all. He was focused solely on himself. Well, God invites us into a Christian life that is complex, that requires discernment, that requires balancing multiple goods that could be in tension at the same time. But in each of these situations that we've read about this morning in Jeremiah and in this rich man in Lazarus, there were pathways in both of those situations in which Jeremiah and the rich man could provide for their needs and wants, but yet at the same time help foster the flourishing of the people around them and their community. Our readings today tell us that our lives are not zero-sum games. My flourishing doesn't have to come at your expense. I can work for the goals that I have in life, but I can also work for yours too. And God encourages us to try to do both of those things at the same time. Oftentimes our world doesn't work like this. I don't know about you, but in the mornings I flip up my news app and I read about famines and major frauds and wars and crazy stuff, almost all of which doesn't need to happen. And if people made more loving choices, those things wouldn't happen. But in our readings this morning, God inspires us to live with hope, even in the midst of all of the troubles of our world and our lives. And to know that God is still at work, creating this new and just and caring world. And then God invites us to join in this divine work along with God. Jeremiah bought that land and put that deed of sale into an earthenware pot as a sign of hope for that entire city that was under siege. This week, how will you do something like that? How will you provide the people around you with a sense of hope that God is still at work? And how will you join in God's effort of creating a world of loving care for everyone.